Welcome everybody to the Be Ready to Play webinar in association with UPMC. The title of today's webinar is Game-Based Coaching. Our presenter today is Seoirse Bulfin. Seoirse brings today with him 25 years of coaching experience. He's the current senior coach for the Wexford Senior Hurling team and is a current lecturer in Limerick IT Sports Department. He is also a PhD candidate in Mary Immaculate. And thank you for giving your time for this session, Seoirse. So, without further ado, I'll let Seoirse present, and I'll be back in later on with some questions that have been submitted prior to the session.
Just share the screen there now.
Yeah.
Is that okay there now, James?
Yeah. If you want to put it onto full screen, yeah.
Yeah. You can see that there, James?
Yeah, I can see that.
That's perfect. Okay, first of all, James, thanks a million for asking me to present today. I'm delighted to be asked to go on to this Be Ready to Play series of webinars. I saw some of them already, so I realised this was the benefits of them and how interesting. I learned an awful lot from them myself. So folks, today's topic is basically, it's an overview, if you like, of the games-based approach to coaching versus kind of the traditional approach. And just to give you a brief outline of the actual session, I'm going to look at just a very brief kind of background to game-based coaching and how that has sort of infiltrated the game, for want of a better word, at the moment. I'm going to look then at kind of the contemporary versus the traditional approach to coaching and how I suppose the two can be best married together, because I think there's no right or wrong way to coach anyone, whether it is be it 6-year-olds or 46-year-olds. And it's just that integration of the contemporary and traditional approach I think is very, very important to get right. Looking then at the benefits of the game-based approach, and we look at them from two different aspects, maybe currently, which is all around return to play after most athletes at all levels have been out of that sort of team sport or that contact sport environment for so long. There's a huge benefit to the game-based approach to coaching from that point of view. And then just generally speaking as well, if there's any normal year, we look at the benefits of the game-based approach. And just finally then is the final fourth point we're going to look at maybe is the why of the games-based approach to coaching. Why should we go away from the traditional? And as I said, it's important that we don't kind of completely forget the past when it comes to how we prepare teams and individuals for GA activity. But I suppose I'm going to look at maybe why I find games-based coaching so beneficial to males and females of all ages and all levels. So that's excuse me, a kind of a brief background to what we're looking at. I suppose just to kick off then, from the point of view, the overview of the games-based coaching sessions, obviously it's relatively new in terms of GA. It would have kind of, I suppose, burst onto the scene, for want of a better word, maybe in the last 15, maybe 18 years or so. Up to that, it would have been very much traditional kind of drills, repetitive drills, straight line running, working on, I suppose, the basics of our sports, whether it is hurling, Gaelic football, camogie, or ladies football. A lot of the kind of research and the history to games-based coaching would have arisen maybe in soccer and sports like that. I'm sure most people who are into the soccer who are watching today or listening today are aware of things like the famed Ajax Academy, which was, where kids are kind of taught the skills of the game. And if you like, even taught is a sort of a very general term, because they're kind of left to their own devices, which at 8, 9, 10, 11 years of age is an interesting approach as well, where they might be playing 3v3 games, and a lot of the kind of spatial awareness and the concept of their sport are treated in that environment where it's a mini small-sided game as opposed to very one-dimensional drills. And then that moved on, I think, just when Johan Cruyff moved to Barcelona. He would have brought that to the La Masia Academy they had there and set that up. And again, Barcelona would have adopted that kind of game-based approach to the development of their younger athletes. So like anything, I suppose, that develops around the world and is seen as pretty successful. It infiltrates other sports, and as I said, that's kind of brings us up to where we are in terms of the GAA and the games-based approach to coaching. And as I just mentioned already, I suppose the contemporary idea around coaching and preparing teams and individuals, and as I said, this goes from everyone who's 4 or 5 years of age right up to senior intercounty males and females. The contemporary approach, as I said, now that most people are incorporating into their sessions, there's a lot of game-based stuff. As I said, traditionally we've done drills in isolation, where you were maybe on your own with the ball, whether it was shooting, whether it was touch, whether it was kick passing, whatever it was. It was very much sort of in isolation, and it wasn't as realistic to the game-based scenario. Just far and against both methods. Personally, I like a sort of a twofold approach to skill development and to developing your teams and your athletes from the point of view of Gaelic games. And as I said, would I favour one over the other, the kind of contemporary games-based approach versus the traditional drills-based approach? Not necessarily. What you will find, I think I'll touch on it later in the webinar, is it's very much kind of what fits the group you're with at that time. Don't kind of nail yourself as a purely games-based approach, or don't say, listen, I don't agree with that, I'm all about the drills-based coaching. I think being able to adapt, and maybe, with one particular group, it might be 80% to 20% ratio. Another group you're working on, maybe the following night, it could be 80-20% ratio the other way. So it's very much, maybe the age group you're with, the level of athletes you're dealing with. And that's why I'm saying you kind of incorporate and you embrace all things, because, anything that can be of benefit to your athletes is hugely important. So that's why I would be saying, not necessarily to favour one over the other. I do believe that the games-based approach and the modern kind of contemporary approach to coaching is obviously, at the moment anyway, is the research, and a lot of what we're being told is this is the best way of getting our people ready for competition and for games. And ultimately, again, regardless of the age or the athletes you're dealing with, as a coach, your main job is to, again, I'm strong at this in saying that it's very much relevant to the age group you're with, but your job as a coach is to develop them, I suppose, from a skill point of view. You're to develop them holistically as people, but ultimately, when it comes to competition, when it comes to game time, they have to be able to I suppose, maximise their performance, and how best to do that at the moment. There is a leaning towards the contemporary games-based approach to coaching. And the funny thing is, I suppose all of us are coming out of maybe the bones of 18 months of lockdown now, where we've had some sporadic sport dotted across the 18 months. And just my third point that I want to develop on is the benefits of the game-based approach. And currently, and just generally speaking, now I kind of touched already on the general benefits that I see to the games-based approach to coaching, but I think it's exceptionally relevant currently in the scenario we find ourselves, where we're returning to play, particularly after the last lockdown, where intercounty players weren't back for maybe did 6 months, the ones of 6 months without any sort of contact, without any real game-based scenarios in our coaching. Club players might have been 8 to 10 months without that sort of very realistic competition game-based scenario. So I think now to integrate your games-based approach into the coaching is exceptionally important, and that goes whether you're in pre-season with maybe a club group currently, whether you're in the middle of your season, or like a lot of intercounty teams are kind of getting ready now, they're in the final run into championship. And I said the reason I find the games-based approach really, really pertinent and very, very important currently is down to the fact that you've such a short window with these players and with these athletes, and they've been out of the loop, if you like, for so long of any sort of competitive sport. As we know, particularly club level, a lot of your males and females will play different sports over the winter, and while the skills might be slightly different to the hurling, camogie, Gaelic football type of skills, they're still used to kind of spatial awareness, they're used to taking hits, they're used to contact if they're playing other team sports. The hand-eye coordination is kind of topped up, whereas now you're coming out of basically a phase which hopefully we will never see again in our lives, but it's completely new to everyone. So you literally could do nothing, only train on your own for 7, 8, 9, in some cases maybe 10 months without any action. And as a result of that, then integrating the games-based approach as quickly as possible to your training sessions is hugely beneficial, because you're getting your athletes up to speed, and you're kind of reminding them what it's like to work in that sort of team environment where games are very fluid, where it's not a lot of straight line stuff, where you're going to be, maybe you won't be striking the ball with oceans of space and no one around you in the game, or very, very rarely anyway. And even when we went back there with one of the teams I'm involved with there in the middle or end of April, guys were in very good physical condition. But after the first session, when I turned up to the second session, I was talking to a couple of guys beforehand, and they just felt they had used muscles they hadn't used for so long, and they took kind of knocks that they weren't used to taking, that, you know, that's why that games-based approach, as quickly as possible, once it's managed and once the load is managed, is hugely important. And as I said, look, it's important that you manage that as well, and that's why I suppose I meant to say this earlier. Any sort of games-based approach, I would say, particularly now returning to play, if you're lucky enough to be in a scenario or a situation where you have some sort of an S&C type specialist with you, I would say defer to those people and take as much information as possible from them regarding the loading and how best to start implementing the games-based approach. Is it 3 aside? Is it 10 aside? What's best for them? And I know, look, at maybe elite club level and inter-county level, it's probably easier to have access to these specialists and these experts in their field. But what I would urge, I just know myself from the day-to-day job, I'm dealing with students. There's countless third level institutions out there who have, you know, student coaches and student S&C coaches, you know, only looking for experience. So as I would say, I'm not an S&C specialist at all. I suppose my interest lies in coaching. So when you're looking at this return to play, make sure you try and get your feedback and your information from some sort of a specialist, because I know I was talking to a friend of mine who was hurling with a club relatively local to me, and the first 2 or 3 nights back that the club were back, they didn't see a ball, and they were just running to the ground. And again, that wasn't done deliberately, it was done through no one's fault. It was just that's the coach, effectively a hurling coach, and he felt that they were out of action for so long, they needed this, whereas most guys and girls in this day and age will keep a fairly good level of fitness up. So it's important, I would say, when you get back collectively, to get as much ball work done as possible, and to do that in that kind of game-based scenario. So I can't underestimate, so particularly for all of us coming out of such a long lockdown where there was literally nothing done, only training in isolation, that you do, if possible, of course, please do try and incorporate maybe some sort of an S&C coach. If you don't have access to one the whole time, maybe get your club or your team just to literally consult with a person to come up with some sort of maybe a plan for your first couple of weeks and stuff for your athletes as to how best to integrate the workload where you're coming from, boys and girls and men and women training on their own, to all of a sudden be back into high intensity, high volume, lots of contact, and how best to manage that without picking up injuries. Because again, every week you see, since the inter-county teams are back, guys are picking up the kind of the soft tissue type things, you know, things like muscular issues, you know, hamstrings, grinds, because it's been so long since they would have done anything collectively, and it's just trying to get that balance right between getting people ready for championship and also then you know, managing that kind of expectation that guys will be back and girls will be back relatively quickly to where they were maybe pre-lockdown, when in fact it does take a little bit longer. So as I said, that's currently, I think, in this environment of a return to play scenario where we've been out for so long, I think it's hugely important that we do use that game-based approach as quickly as possible. Now, I'll touch on it later in the chat as well, that I will be doing the very same in a normal year as well. Generally speaking, I would also be bringing in the games-based approach as quickly as possible to my training and my coaching sessions. And as I said, generally, you know, the reason that, you know, games-based coaching has become so prevalent in most team sports is a lot of it is due to the fact that, as I said, you know, you can do your skills in isolation, but sports that we have which are highly technical, but yet there's a lot of contact involved, there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of spatial awareness required. If you're doing those skills in isolation, it's fine, they can be honed, but then it takes that little bit longer if your athletes are only going to try and get up to game speed in actual, league challenge games prior to championship. So if you can just incorporate it more into your general approach to training, you'll see the benefits very, very quickly. So I'm going to move on maybe to my next slide. I have about 9 points. I think I have 8 points, and I repeat one twice because for me it's hugely important. And I suppose that is, why do we actually use a games-based approach? And as I said, I kind of already mentioned it, it's a twofold thing for me. It's hugely important currently because we're coming out of a kind of a lockdown in a scenario that we hadn't seen for we've never seen in our lifetime, thankfully, and hopefully won't see again. But just to move on to the more general, I suppose, reasoning why I would take a games-based approach, not necessarily just because it's very much the thing to do now, and it's a lot of coaches are preaching this, that the only way forward is games-based approach. For me, it's hugely beneficial, but it does need to be kind of managed, if you like, and it does need to be integrated with the skills of the game. And I hope I'm not contradicting myself here with my first point, as I've been kind of eulogizing the benefits of the games-based approach up to this point, and I've seen how important it is. But for me, the Gaelic games, and I've no problem saying are the greatest games in the world. And I think from the point of view of the skill execution and the skill level required to play either hurling, football, ladies football or camogie at all levels are exceptionally high. They're, technically you have to be very, very proficient, to be able to perform and to at any particular level in your sport. So with that in mind, the first point I'd make is you do not forget the basics. And I've had this debate with other coaches at various levels. Some people will completely go away from the drills-based thing of sessions and go full-on games-based approach. For me, and my sport ultimately is hurling, you can't forget the basics. And I think particularly, when you're coming back after a long time out, it's important, within your squad, some people will probably have done a little bit of work on their own, others may not, from the point of view of working on their touch and their striking. So from that point of view, I think it's very important that we integrate the games-based approach with your general sort of skill development, skill acquisition type stuff. And particularly, again, if you're looking at younger groups, if you're looking at maybe, kids in their early to mid-teens who wouldn't be as technically proficient maybe as older groups within your club, it's important that these people are given the time to work on their skills as well. Be it maybe a little bit of homework after a session where they have to go to hurling a wall, or maybe go and kick a few balls in the field, maybe with a friend if it's kind of the work on their kick passing, or if you build it into the session. My idea would be to build it into your sessions, and even currently we will be doing some of that. Now, how you do it yourself, it depends. One way you can do it is you can have maybe if it's almost like a recovery session, if you've had a couple of heavy duty contact sessions where you've had lots of games-based sessions and you want to maybe taper back on the contact and the loading, you can do a full-on non-contact skill session. So you're looking from hurling point of view, you're looking at your striking, your touch, maybe your shooting, uncontested shooting, where you move away from the sort of game-based scenario. So you might do one of those in every 4 or 5 sessions. So I kind of roughly have a 1-to-4 ratio, and that's very rough, and there's no science behind that. That's just what works for me. And the other thing I would say is, back yourself as a coach. You've got to use whatever works for you and what has worked for you. Don't be afraid to learn, obviously, but make sure you kind of you use what works for you. And as for me, it's that sort of 1-to-4 ratio. So if it's one full-on games-based or one full-on skills-based approach where it's just purely touch, striking, and when I say touch and striking, I obviously thought from a hurling point of view, where you have no contact, it's all skills-based. Maybe your next 3 sessions might be your games-based approach. You might just have a hurling warm-up that's uncontested, where you're just sharpening up for the session. But generally, your next 3 to 4 sessions might be, all games-based. Or another way of doing that was maybe have 25% of every session skills-based. So you might have one kind of drill or 1.5 to 2 drills, depending on how long your session is going to be, skills-based, uncontested, purely based on the traditional method of kind of working on your skills in isolation. As I said, for me, and I can really only speak for hurling, you can't get away from the fact that getting your touch and your striking right. And as I said, not all of us are blessed with, you know, the skills of a TJ Reid or an Aaron Gillan or these guys, where you can turn up and you can literally, without much effort, you can kind of get up to that speed in a game environment. So particularly for the younger people, it's important, because I found with different groups I've seen and I've worked with over the years, if you throw the games-based approach at some of these athletes, and from a skill proficiency level, if they're not quite up to it, they'll fall behind, because they'll get frustrated because maybe some of their teammates at 13 or 14 are doing things in a game-based scenario that they're just not capable of, because they're not as far advanced. You know, if you're talking about elite club level, if you're talking about inter-county level, there's like you know, an expectation nearly everyone in the squad will be able to hold their own in the games-based scenarios and in the games-based games. So that's why, you know, it's a little bit easier to maybe work with the more elite, the more, I suppose, specialised people who are playing their sport for longer. But definitely for the younger age groups, you're going to have a right mix with the group in front of you. And I did a session for the lads last year here, the under 12s, and I went up with sort of kind of an open mind from the point of view of the session I planned. A little bit of game-based stuff, a little bit of kind of skills and isolation stuff. And it had been so long since I kind of worked with younger people. You know, I found it strange in a sense, if you like, to see that you could literally split the group in three. There was one relatively weak group, there was one group that were middle of the road, and there was one group that were that bit more advanced than the rest of the group. So maybe I think with 23 or 4 there, you could have kind of split it into maybe 3 groups of 8 from the point of view of where they were ability-wise. And that's the same across the board in every club, maybe at underage level. So it's important to try and bring, you know, what's the collective best method to bring all of those along, that you're not having the first maybe 8 streaking too far away from the remaining 16 or the bottom 8 within that group, because obviously, you know, to progress as they get up through the age groups, you're going to need them to come together collectively. So you need to find a happy medium where, you know, maybe the smaller group, or for want of a better word, the weaker group gets to do a little bit more of the skill-based drills and isolation type thing to bring them up to speed before you put them into the games-based scenario where they might struggle a little bit. So just mix and match the approach and be very, very cautious as to how you use games-based and traditional. And as I said, it's for me, you know, it's very specific to you and to the group you're with as to which is based on what ratio you use. But for me, as I said, start, you know, don't forget the basics, regardless of the level. You know, and again, I'm speaking from a hurling point of view, I'm sure football is probably the same. Your touch, your striking, you know, your kick passing, the basics are hugely important, so you can't fully move away from them. And again, that's my opinion, that's how I approach things. I suppose the second point I want to make there is condition games and what I call positive conditioning. Luckily enough, I suppose in the last 10 years, even at club level, I've noticed that, you know, even from my time starting out as a club player, you know, you'd certain guys in the squad, when they came back in January, you know, they had to knock maybe, you know, a couple of stone off them, or to get fit. And the traditional way of doing that was you were just running endlessly, and people don't like that. What I find a huge benefit to the games-based approach is this whole notion of kind of, as I said, what I call it positive conditioning. You know, if you tell someone to run around for 20 minutes to run laps of the field, 90% of the guys and girls within the squad, they'll be moaning and owning and groaning before they start, and it just kicks things off on a negative straight away to the session. Whereas if you throw in a ball, there can be running and doing stuff, and it can be very specific to maybe how you're going to be playing in 4 or 5 months' time in championship. But all of a sudden, they're playing with a ball for 20 minutes, and maybe doing some games that you've devised yourselves. It's a whole other ball game. So the training they're doing is far more specific to what you want later on in the year. And yet, if you ask someone, listen, you can follow a ball for 20 minutes, or you can just run laps for 20 minutes, and do all sorts of other exercises as well. You know, I would say 99.9% of us want to be doing stuff with the ball, and we, you know, to have that sort of condition type game scenario. So from that point of view, I think it's a huge benefit in pre-season that those kind of the condition games, if you like, are done in such a way that you're building that sort of aerobic base. And again, this can be done if you're looking at an S&C person within your setup. Let that S&C person say, right, these are the markers we need to hit. What kind of games can you come up with? This is, you know, as a coach, and you're tested to see what I can come up with to make sure maybe boys and girls are covering X amount of high-speed yards in a session, are covering maybe X amount of kilometers if you're lucky enough to have things like GPS units, and even if most people have drawn little activity trackers now. So these are all big benefits to preparing your teams at all levels. And as I said, particularly for the older age groups where you're looking at adults coming back, where you have to do some little bit of maybe a pre-season aerobic base that has to be kind of instilled into the group. Games-based approach is a really good way of getting that base into your players. The other thing is it's far more realistic. So any S&C coach will tell you that, the long steady running, how often in a game of hurling or football or camogie or ladies football for that matter, will you be running at the same pace continuously? You won't. So it's that kind of those aerobic and anaerobic bursts of energy, if you like, and energy expenditure are replicated in these pre-season conditioned games. And obviously in pre-season, those games might go on for a little bit longer because you might want to get a little bit of conditioning into what you're looking to develop fitness levels. And obviously then maybe a week before championship, 5 or 6 months later, they're going to be really short, snappy and intense, and you're going to be really focused on the skills side of things. So it's one of the big benefits for me with the games-based approach. And I think it's a long time since I would, and I suppose most people now, to be fair, would do very little kind of mindless running in pre-season, but you still hear of it. So it's just, as I said, 90% of people probably moved away from that, but it's still prevalent in certain places, in certain clubs, and certain coaches and S&C people will still look at that sort of, that slog, if you like, has been a vital part of developing your athletes. For me, I think all that kind of conditioning can be done in the games-based approach, and that's a huge benefit to games-based approach to coaching. Third point I have there is just the point of developing decision makers. Again, if you're looking at developing or working on your skills in isolation, there's very little, I suppose, if there is thought goes into it, but if you're doing a striking drill and the only object of me is to come out, collect my ball, take my touch, take my steps and strike the ball, a couple of those and all of a sudden your player is on autopilot because they're just going through the motions, they're not being tested. And it is fine to hone, as I said, and getting back to my first point about the basics, it's great like that to let them switch off maybe from the intensity of the games-based approach and get back to honing the skills which they're almost doing an autopilot. Now again, depending on the level and the age group you're working with, those standalone drills in isolation will be a little bit more difficult for your athletes. But again, the thing with the games-based approach is all of a sudden, if you're playing a mini game, if it's 4 aside, if it's 3 aside, if there's a certain amount of passes, or you have to get into zones or get out of the zones, all of a sudden a ball is played to me, my touch has to be right. But not only can I just focus on my touch, you have to think maybe 1 move and 2 moves ahead. Right, once I have the ball in my hand, where do I go from here? What do I do next? How do I bring my teammates into it? How do I make a run without the ball that's going to maybe bring my marker with me and create space for my teammate with the ball? So all of those things are hugely beneficial from the game-based approach, and it's just those decision makers. Look, as coaches, we all know our job realistically is to try and, as I said already, you have a couple of jobs. You're trying to develop your athletes as athletes. I think in this day and age, it's hugely important to develop your athletes holistically. And the importance, and what I've learned over the years is it's very important for us that, in the past I might have thought that Tuesday night, Thursday night, if your athletes are going well in training and they perform very well on a Tuesday or Thursday, well, they'll automatically play very well on a Saturday or Sunday. We now realise that's not the case, that what goes on in their own private lives has a huge bearing on their, I suppose, ability to perform when, in sport as well. So you're trying to maximize the player's performance, and in doing that, you're trying to develop these decision makers so that when the pressure comes on, and as I said, as a coach, your job is to try and replicate match day scenarios. I'm actually coming on to that in my next point. You will never 100% replicate the match day scenario. It's impossible because you have too many variables that are out of your control. Things like, referees, crowd, opposition, maybe knowing your own players and training that you're marking and not knowing the opposition. So what can you do to really ready your players for that? And I said, these small-sided games-based approach to coaching is brilliant because it develops and it starts to develop decision makers. And I see that the younger age groups you can start with that, the better. Just watching recently, I was above watching, I have 3 daughters, and the eldest 2 now are old enough to play camogie, and I go up and I was watching my wife coaching and they have a very strong club, so they might have one coach to 5 or 6 players, and it's just watching them, just how they, you know, even at 7, 8 years of age, very, very basic. You're throwing in a ball and you might just let them play away for it, and you might ask them a question, you know, why did you do that? And then what would you do the next time? And you're just developing that sort of idea of decision making, and how that decision and how the decisions you make as an athlete are going to implicate, or how going to actually impact on your teammates. And that brings me on then to just replicating the match day scenario. And as I said, you will never 100% cover match day scenarios. It's impossible to really replicate that fully. So you have to get as close as possible to that. And that's another huge benefit with the games-based approach, because, you know, all of a sudden the drills in isolation are fine, but in a game, as I said, regardless of the level, regardless of the sport that I suppose belong to the GAA family, you're not going to, or you will very, very, very rarely find yourself all on your own with loads of time to execute the skill that you've been, you know, working on in training. Whereas, you know, if you're executing that same skill with bodies around you, while you're being tackled, while you have to think about your next move, and you're doing that in training, it will automatically, or should automatically, come a little bit easier the next day you have a game. So again, as I said, that's why they're very, very important, and they're very good to kind of, if you look at as replicating match day scenarios, and just even if you look at my next point here about correcting inaccurate execution, and just to look at that point, even look written down, it has sort of negative connotations. So I might rephrase that and say, you know, it's about executing positive and accurate skills as opposed to correcting things. But ultimately, you know, if you have a game on a Saturday or Sunday, and there are certain points that you as a coach pick out that you need to work on, whether it's a decision making in front of goal, whether it's a defensive scenario where you know, 2 players went to the one guy coming through, you know, how do you correct these little things? And you can talk your athletes through it, but what I find is if you put them into your game-based scenarios and almost replicate what happened in the previous game, say, right, this happened that Sunday, we missed the score, we coughed up a score, we gave away a silly free a couple of times because of it. What would you do as athletes? And again, you know, how you approach the questioning of your athletes will vary with the level and the age they're at. Obviously, at 8, 9, 10 years of age, there's an awful lot more direction required than maybe a very good minor team, for argument's sake. So again, correcting things that, you know, and you will never eradicate mistakes. It's important, but I always say, if you make the mistake, you learn from it. If you don't learn from it, then there's something wrong, maybe, then you have an issue. So you make the mistake, the next day you'll make other mistakes, but just try not to make the same mistakes. So how do you do that? How do you try and ensure that you don't make the same mistakes? Again, game-based, maybe training session where you maybe a game or two the following Tuesday or Wednesday night after a game, say, right, this is what happened Saturday, this is what happened Sunday, this is what we did, what would we do differently? And you set it up that way, and you get feedback from your players. And again, as I said, there's a kind of a note of caution here as a coach that, you know, a lot of the feedback you'll be getting and will require is going to vary depending on the group you're with. But that's another, for me, a big benefit of the games-based approach, where you're looking at kind of things that might have maybe haven't worked out for you the previous game. How can you put that right if it comes up again? And as I said, you're never going to play the perfect game. You're never going to rule out mistakes. But my approach is that, listen, let's try and make sure that there are no mistakes the next day, that we're not repeating our mistakes. Because if we are, then you have an issue. Whereas if you're new mistakes every week, a new couple of mistakes to work on, that's something you're learning anyway, because you haven't made the same mistakes again. Another thing that I've done with teams, and we've done with teams, is the whole notion of set plays. And as I said, look, practicing your skills in isolation aren't going to realistically have any bearing on your set plays. They will on the execution of the skills within the set play, but if you have a particular line ball or a free that you want to work on with your athletes, again, the best way of doing that is setting it up in training, either on a small side of game, or maybe even if you've 30 and 30 and only tell the one group we're trying to execute it, because what you'll find is any sort of pre-organized kind of moves and set plays, everyone in your squad knows them because they're all part of it, and they have a tendency to break down at times because the guy you're marking knows where you should be running, what you should be doing. So from that point of view, you should try and maybe look at if you are working with a particular set play, as I said, you work just with maybe one group. Don't tell the opposition, in this term I mean the opposition by the rest of the guys on your squad. Don't tell them if it's a new play, because as I said, they'll be a step ahead of the guys and it breaks down. But again, that games-based approach, if you're working on set plays, there's only one way to do that, and that's in a game-based scenario. I have a point there. Point 7 is walkthroughs. While this isn't necessarily full-on games-based approach to something, it's sort of like the whole idea of your scenarios, where you might set up your teams and you might just throw in a ball or give a ball to a particular player and say, right, play it from here. What do you do? How are you going to react? What does the guy marking you do? That can be done if you're playing a team maybe the following weekend to play a certain way. Okay, or they have certain individuals that play a certain way. You give the ball to one of the opposition. How is that going to be changed? How are you going to alter that? So those walkthroughs, what I will say is, they can, for the athletes, be a little bit boring, because by their very nature, your commodity players, hurlers, Gaelic footballers, lady footballers, they want to be running, they want to be all action all the time. This is a little bit slower. It's when you consider a game-based approach is I suppose questionable. I put it in there because it is important to get certain scenarios that you may face, you have faced, executed correctly. And I was involved with the local commode team here last year, who kind of had which was new to them. And initially they were tearing their hair out. I was tearing my hair out, but we persisted. And what we did was we worked on it from the point of view of puck outs and maybe looking at the breaks and how we could maximise that. So that's, as I said, when I say walkthroughs there, what I mean by that is you might set up your teams, or maybe half your team, so maybe a set of backs and forwards, and just maybe break it down even more than a games-based approach, where guys are going for their 90 seconds on or their 90 seconds off, whatever it is, where it's literally, right, there's the ball, there might be a player or two in it, and you might hold it up and say, right, what did happen here? Why did this happen? Again, I wouldn't be doing this maybe with the 7 or 8-year-olds. This is probably your athletes that at the other end of the scale. They're probably a little bit more elite. They're older. They can manage it better. And even I be honest, even adults at times find these a little bit frustrating. And I wouldn't spend long on them. I might spend 7 or 8 minutes at the end of the session, or perhaps if there's a specific game or two that you want, or some player or two that you want to work on, maybe for you, or if you know a team that you're playing the next day out play a certain way, that's when I would do those kind of walkthroughs. While what you will find is they can be frustrating in the beginning, but very quickly I found that your athletes, that they find the benefit to them, so they will get into it. Just one quick note, if you are doing it maybe in it's earlier in the year and it's maybe cold, if you're doing it at the end of the session, it's probably the best time to make sure your athletes are well and truly wrapped up, because it is, as I said, it's maybe done at the end of the session where your session is finished and it's a little bit more, there isn't much pace to it. So the second last point is make sure that you're, whatever you're doing training, whether it is the skills or the game as such, is specific and unique to you and your team. And this is something, I suppose, this is the one thing that I've learned over the years and I've developed personally, because maybe 7 or 8 years ago I would have maybe seen a drill or a small set of game and said, gee, that's brilliant. I'm going to do that the following night with whatever team I was working with. And you could do it and it could break down immensely, because maybe the team aren't capable of carrying out that drill or that small set of game. Maybe it's not relevant to the way you want to play. For argument's sake, if you have a team who want to run the ball and you see a drill being done by a team or a coach who do a lot of direct ball and winning maybe high ball, winning primary possession, but your own team are playing a different way, well, there isn't much point in doing that then if there's no relevance to the way you want to play. So that is important. So make sure it's specific and unique to you, and that goes to all age groups. And I said I would have been guilty of that. It's something I'm still trying to, I suppose, bad habit I'm trying to knock out of myself, is that I see something and say, yeah, it's really good, let's do it, without maybe thinking beforehand, is it going to work to the benefit of the team I'm with? So no, what I will say is don't be afraid to try things and let them fail. But if something, as I said, the example I gave there, if you're a team that plays the ball really short, maybe works the ball through the lines, and isn't going to change that much, there isn't much point in working on maybe long striking, if you're short striking, your hand pass isn't up to speed. So just that's a very extreme example, but just make sure it's specific to how you want to play. But the other thing I would say is don't ever be afraid to try things and to fail as a coach, because every day you're failing, you're learning. It's like my previous point about correcting maybe mistakes in the game. You have to do the very same as a coach, and every night I take a session, I make at least 1 or 2 mistakes, and my attitude is, if I don't make the same mistakes again, well, then it's a positive mistake. If there is such thing as a positive mistake, you know, that's important, that you are willing to learn from those mistakes and to move on. And so my final point brings me back to my first point, and that is we can't forget the basics. And games-based approach is brilliant. It's an important, hugely important to development of athletes at all age groups and all levels. But for me, and just from my hurling background, you know, a sport, you know, if you're very technically proficient at, do not go away from the basics. Regardless of whether you're the 6-year-old starting out or the 30-year-old with 10 years senior to county experience, male or female, keep working on the basics and the skills. How you integrate that into your sessions as a coach is completely up to you. But I would look at integrating that somewhere. Just to finish up, hopefully you've gotten something from that overview for the last 35 or 40 minutes. If there's anything that I maybe that you wanted to question further or want a little bit of information, you can email me there at seoirse.bulfin@lit.ie, or you can contact me on Twitter just at seoirse.bulfin. So I said, if there's anything else you'd like to know, please feel free to contact me on either of those methods. Okay, thanks, James. Back to you.
Thanks, Seoirse, and I'd say you're going to be inundated with emails and tweets in the next couple of weeks. No, that was very, very informative there. If you want to stop sharing your screen, your end there,
yeah,
we'll just take a couple of questions. Just, I suppose, throughout the session, you kind of mentioned maybe underage, say, children, youths, adults. From a game-based point of view, is there any kind of age that specifically you'd start, or is this something that is just there throughout?
I suppose it's something you try and, I suppose, in an ideal world, if you're in a club where there's a very clear pathway from where you come in into the nursery at 5 or 6 years of age to what you ultimately see in 15 years time as adult players, well then I suppose you will link into whatever sort of framework or pathway that club are using. But for me, I don't think there's any age where you shouldn't be starting. I think I've seen actually other sports. I was at another sport there recently where there was maybe 8-year-old girls playing a particular sport, and I'd say there was probably 24 of them with one ball. So, and you know, there was maybe 2 of them got a touch for most of it. So for me, as I said, my wife is coaching the 6s, the 8s in the club here, and I'm watching them and the other coaches, and what they're doing is, you know, if there's a group of 5 or 6, they might play 2-a-side or 3-a-side at the end of the night. There's no structure, there's no rules, they're just hitting a few balls, and they're not even giving them much guidance. So what they're doing is, they're just getting used to, just instead of dribbling a ball in and out and the straight line stuff that I said, all of a sudden there's bodies around them. They're trying to get used to, right, is that person with me? Is that person against me? Just something as simple as, if I have the ball on my feet and there's someone running at me, what do I do? Also, they'll practice little things that in the other stations they'll do, but when it comes to the game-based stuff, it's very basic, and as I said, it's not even structured, but subconsciously I think they're still getting the idea that, geez, there's other people on this pitch. It's not going to be me on my own doing something. It will be for the next couple of years maybe, but generally speaking, we're playing a game where there's going to be contact, where there's going to be people with you, people against you, and it's just, even without that structure that you maybe get at adult level, even at 6 or 7 years of age, if they're playing 2 or 3-a-side with one of those big go games balls, they're kind of learning themselves almost subconsciously. I think it's very important as well, and I've seen this in all sports, is, you know, for me, if you've under 8s, no matter how good or bad you're, I don't see the point in playing 8-10-a-side, you know. Bring it right down, 3-a-side, have plenty coaches, small little pitches if you like, and let them learn and develop that way. Let them look at the kind of spatial awareness, how, you know, a person doesn't have to always make a run to try and take a pass, or how they'll create space. And instead, you know, your coaching will be limited enough then, you're only kind of popping in and out to give a little bit of guidance that they start learning themselves. Like, realistically, by the time you get to kind of elite level, whether that's in their mid to late teens or adults, coaching is almost, you know, you should very little coaching. That said, you might be tweaking things tactically more than anything, but all the coaching is done, and they should have learned an awful lot of that kind of spatial awareness, that notion of how to get around the pitch, how to create space, how to maybe block space. We come from, you know, as I said, the subconscious started maybe 5 and 6 years of age.
Yeah.
I hope that answers the question.
No, it does. And I suppose just an extension of that, I suppose you touched on it there with I think you had mentioned earlier on about the under 8s and maybe questioning some of the decisions, or why did you do that, and where would you go next. That question and approach it works hand in hand with the game-based approach, and I suppose we can all get lots of games, but if the question approach isn't marred with it, it's probably not going to work. Would that be fair to say? Or and I suppose, how do you develop that? Is the next question.
Again, you're 100% correct. It's kind of one of the points I made earlier, I think, was, where I said even that you see a drill and you do it, but there's no impact or benefit to your own team. And it's the very same. There's no point in doing the games-based approach if you're not getting feedback from your players, because ultimately what you're trying to develop is a group of, I suppose, individuals who are kind of thinking as one, but thinking themselves, if you know what I mean. There's no point, once a game starts, you can do all the advice and roar and shout from the sideline, but ultimately, we've been proven at all levels that the teams who can make the decisions themselves on the field and figure things out themselves are ultimately the most successful. I think if you look at the Dublin football team over the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, Jim Gavin before Desi Farrell, the big thing was that they have to see things and figure things out for themselves. So even as I said, at 6 years of age, this questioning obviously is going to be a little bit different than it would be to a Dublin senior footballer. But why did you hit the ball over there? Or and again, we're very lucky. We have a number of teachers, primary and secondary teachers, involved with the 6s and 8s in the Commode Club here, and I see they're way better doing it. They're naturally good at it. So it's the way they ask the questions and how basic they kind of frame them is very, very important. But as I said, you're not going to really throw a humdinger at a 6-year-old, but just a little thing. Why did you change hands there?
Yeah.
Why did you move there? And just sometimes the answers might be off the wall, which you'd expect from a 6-year-old, but it's all you're doing is you're almost like you're planting the seed for them that when they're maybe 11 or 12 or 13 or 14, they're used to being questioned, and at that stage their thought process, you're developing that thought process a little bit more, that they're thinking a little bit deeper about why something was done or why something should be done. Now, the last thing you want as well, James, is overthinking things, particularly when it comes to matches. You're looking at that ideal performance state and the notion of flow. But again, if you start that question process as early as possible, it embeds that sort of sense of curiosity, if you like, and they, like your players, and don't be afraid of your players kind of question you as a coach. There's ways of going at it, but obviously don't be afraid of that, and have plenty of debate with your players and bring them into the process as much as possible, particularly the older they get. And I would say 9 times out of 10, if you bring the players on board, regardless of the age, if you want to implement a particular style, get their feedback on it, because ultimately they're the ones that are going to be playing that style. So if they're 14, if they're 24, if they're 10, if you want to play a particular way, but none of them really understand it, or if they're not a fan of it, if they can't implement it, there isn't much point in trying it. So that's why you should engage them in the process the whole time, I would say.
No, very good. And I suppose even go back to your point with the skills of the basics, the question, to bring in the basics and develop it yourself as a coach, and it can be developed over time. No, very good. And I think you're correct on the primary school teachers or the secondary school teachers. I know I work with some with the underage at the moment, and I sponge from them that there's different things and the different.
As I always said, there's 3 particular ladies involved now with the under 8s and the things above with the camogie, and as I said to them, like, you have to be able to coach 6 and 8-year-olds. It's very easy the higher up you get. As I said, it's not easier to do what I do, and I keep saying that. And I couldn't. I went back last year because they were short to coach, and I took the longest 40 minutes of my life, James. I just couldn't hack it. So anyone who's coaching 6, 8, 10-year-olds, those in those nurseries, I have the utmost respect and regard for them, because I said you have to be able to coach at that age, and you have to be able to, you have to have a certain way about you. And again, I said we're just lucky. It just happens that there's a number of teachers involved. How they question the kids and how they engage the kids is on a level way beyond what I'm capable of.
Yeah, no, it's excellent, and it's chaotic but excellent.
Yeah, it's kind of organised chaos.
Yeah. The next question I had, I suppose this year is a slightly different year, and club teams are at probably different phases of getting ready for either leagues or championship in the distance and stuff like that. But the type of games that you play and the time of year, and I suppose the work rest ratio and what you're actually working on. So I suppose there's probably teams still in a mini pre-season at the moment and up to that. How that works or how you bring that
for
in.
our, I'm involved with a club team in Galway this year, and we're not playing club championship for say 3 months. It's the 11th of September that weekend. So what we were doing there, the kind of games we're starting out with at the moment, will be very different to currently maybe what we're doing in Wexford. So again, I touched on it at the start of the talk earlier. If you have an S&C person or someone who's a specialist in that field, engaged in, right, this is pre-season, what's the work to rest ratio? And if you don't, maybe try and pick someone's brains that has some background in it. And if not, then as a coach, back yourself to the of the feel for it. What I find is at this time of the year, you're going to maybe you let the drills go on a little bit longer if you're trying to embed that little bit of condition, that sort of aerobic base. So for argument's sake, generally even at the highest level, those small sided games, once they go beyond 2.5 minutes, if they're done correctly, the quality dips and it's time to pull the pin. Now, in pre-season or the early part of the season, I'm not as much worried about the quality of the drills or the skill execution as I am about, getting that base into the guys, and even if they're a little bit tired, push them a little bit harder to keep kind of their concentration, because obviously when you get tired, the concentration goes and mistakes creep in, and so for argument's sake, a drill you're doing in the month of January, this was the month of May now for pre-season for clubs, month of June, it will be, you might have a much bigger area to cover in that game over a longer period of time, that if you were doing something similar maybe 2 weeks for championship, you might have maybe a lot smaller area, because there's a lot more pressure on the skills to have them execute right if there's a guy going much closer to you, and likewise then the actual area itself would be a lot smaller, and the time frame, so it's a lot volume down, intensity up, and that's the kind of general one thing I've taken from the S&C coaches is start of the year maybe is the volume up, intensity down, and as you get close to championship, it's start of the volume up, volume down, intensity up.
And do you find then, I suppose, over maybe the last couple of weeks, you were going from games, say from weekend to weekend, with matches at the weekend, and then going back into game based? Have you had to alter, and is there times then you go out and have planned on maybe a Thursday that this is what we're going to do, and you just get the feel from the players, okay, the intensity levels there or the energy levels aren't there, and we just have to roll back on it, or what's that like at the moment?
That's an excellent point, and that's something that is being kind of monitored almost daily at the moment. We're very, very lucky in Wexford, and we've Graham Byrne as our S&C coach, and who's as good as I've worked with, to be fair. And the same with Dave. He's a really good kind of way of reading the players. There will be nights you might have a session planned, and maybe 15 minutes into it, say, right, they're a little bit tired or a little bit flat. Maybe the game at the weekend took a little bit more out of them, or the session after it, and you'll tweak it. You might cut the session short. Likewise, if it's going well, and if the S&C coach or the GPS kind of metrics are reasonably good, you might prolong it a little bit more. But that's the one thing that's in a sense the club is I see it with the club involved. There's a big advantage that you have that longer lead in time. From the inter-county point of view, you're back, which was great to be straight into the league and to get your 5 league matches was brilliant. But there's a whole other kind of management set up then around it, from the point of view of watching training load and not doing too much and not doing too little, and just getting that balance right,
Yeah. And just finally, I suppose, as clubs get into, say, championship later on the year, and they could be playing 3 games in 4 weeks or 4 games in 4 weeks, and there's probably not the rest periods, but we usually link our sessions back to the previous game and work on something that needs to be worked on, and reinforce the positives within it. Is that something that you find is harder to do at the moment, or is nearly gone out the window because you're rolling from week to week, or what way?
It can be a little bit tricky to do at the moment. This is what you're trying to do now, and again, I don't want to ever focus on the negative. Is you're kind of, I suppose, part of you saying, well, what we're doing right, we just kind of have to hope that we stay doing right. If there's something major to be corrected, if you like, after the game, there are probably the tendencies to put a little more time on that, to try and get that right, and hope that what you've done positively or correctly, for want of a better word, within the game will be maintained. Now, a week or two later, you might have to tweak that again or go back to work on it, but you don't have that same time frame to maybe you're kind of banking the fact that what you're doing positively. And if it's like things, you know, if you're with a squad for a couple of years, there's a lot more, I suppose, trust and knowledge in the group of what's working, what's not working, what's going well, what isn't going well. So I'd say at the moment you're probably looking at, right, what didn't go well the previous week and with the game again next weekend, how can we tweak that? What can we work on in training? What game can we come up with in training to maybe, you know, just improve that by a little bit?
Yeah.
You know?
No, that's brilliant. I think we could spend another hour here chatting, but I think I'd get in trouble then at that stage. But listen, thanks a million for your time, and very informative. And I think people tuning in will get an awful lot for it. And the best of luck to you for the rest of the year with everything you're doing.
Thanks, James.
So from everybody tuning in, thanks a million for tuning in again. Just from Be Ready to Play series, if the next session we have is on Monday, the 2nd of July. Moving from insight to action is being delivered by Denise Martin and Brian McLennan. So without further ado, I'd just like to thank Seoirse once again. That's the last, or the finish up of the Be Ready to Play game-based session in association with UPMC. Thank you and bye.